Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. Today we're going to talk about how grief affects our ability to make important life decisions. If you go to see a counselor, psychologist, or coach and say you've been considering making a major change in your life, one of the first things we'll ask is, have you suffered any major losses recently? The death of a parent or a close family member? You might be going through a painful breakup or even the loss of a job or a career that you loved. All of these events can trigger grief. And then the grief in turn can trigger a complete reevaluation of your relationships, your career, and your priorities. But can you trust these new insights and emotions that are bubbling up? Or is your grief affecting your ability to make sound decisions? It's a complex question that we are going to try to answer. Now, before we get started, my name is Lisa Oak. I'm an executive counselor based in Singapore and the founder of executivecounseling.com. We conduct online sessions with clients from around the world. And before this, I was a financial journalist, most of that time with CNBC. And on this channel, we aim to bring you interviews with top experts from around the world who can help you with your inner journey, because we all know all the stuff that's happening on the inside. It really has an impact on your day-to-day work life and how you interact with others and how your career proceeds. Now, for our episode today, our guest is one of the world's top experts on grief. He is the founder of grief.com. His first book, The Needs of the Dying, received praise from Mother Teresa. And of course, he co-authored two books with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. You probably know her from The 5 Stages of Grief. He co-authored two books with her. He updated the 5 stages of grief, and he says there is a 6th stage of grief that you need to be aware of. Please welcome to our program today, David Kessler. David, it's wonderful to see you there. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, so glad to be with you and everyone today.
All right. Well, first of all, praise for Mother Teresa. My goodness, tell us about that. I mean, what a big moment that must have been for you. Walk us.
I I was shocked. I was shocked. I my publisher and everyone was sort of begging me to ask her, and I couldn't bring myself to do it. And finally, I did, and I never thought it would happen. So it was such an honor to do that. So I'm so grateful for that. And the other thing I'll say about it is when it happened, I didn't feel like I deserved it. I mean, I was in my 30s, so I was young. And there were so many people I knew who had done so much incredible work. And I think we all get that imposter syndrome from time to time. And I'll tell you what someone said that changed everything. I said to someone, I don't deserve it. And they said, then earn it. And so I have tried to have a life where I'm earning hers and so many other people who have opened so many doors for me.
Oh, well, congratulations on the wonderful body of work that you've put out there. It's certainly helped so many of us. Uh, for today's episode, I want to talk to you a little bit about the impact of grief on the way we make decisions. So many clients show up in our offices and in my office, and they say, "Oh, I'm about to make this huge decision. I'm changing careers. I'm leaving a marriage," is a common one that we see quite a bit. And when you scratch below the surface and you dig a little bit deeper, you find out that there's been a major loss in their lives. And I'm curious, what's your perception on how grief affects our decision-making process?
Grief is a huge catalyst. It becomes a window, a period of reevaluation in our life. We really think about, is this given that, someone has died, someone has left me, something has changed in the world. And I always say, grief is a change we didn't want. Now that this big thing has happened and I'm looking at my life, I think I might want to make changes. And I'll tell you, it's important for us to know personally that it's a time of change. it's also important for us to know in our work world too. You know, a lot of times when I work with executives in large companies, I will tell them, because many times we're a little bit grief illiterate in the work world, just like in the personal world, that grief is an important moment to engage our employees too. So whether we're looking at it from our insides or other people around us, people really evaluate their life and decide, do I want more, different, and make changes in grief?
And it's not just losing a loved one, it can be a job loss as well that triggers grief.
Absolutely. You know, so much of our identity is wrapped up in our work. And it's a very, very hard thing to do. I feel very good about my life. I feel very good about my career, about my success. But I have to tell you, years ago, I was fired from a job. I still to this day have nightmares about that. So it changes everything. So it's interesting how, no matter how it comes about, these changes we didn't want impact us on a deep, deep level.
Yeah, they sure do. Yeah, and I've lost a job too. I think a lot of people have been in
Yeah,
that position, and there's such a sense of a loss of control, and there's a real grieving process afterwards to help get you through it.
absolutely. And, you know, that's why I like to mention it now, going back to that imposter syndrome. I mean, look, we all have successes, we all have failures. That's just part of the road, you know. And I think the more we become honest about it, the easier it all becomes.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, talk to us a little bit about the timeline of grief, instantaneous. And then other times it's more of a slow burn. It takes years. And by the time they come in to talk about it or they're making a decision, they think it's not related to the grief. But when you scratch under the surface, that was probably the catalyst, but it took a long time to sort of come out in the wash. What are the timelines like when you're grieving?
I think they're all over the place. I think there can be like the person you knew that it's right away. Now, what I would say is that many times we think we've got time, we're mulling over things. And then when grief happens, like your friend, like, oh my gosh, I'm not here forever, wake up call that we get, they're like, I'm moving on it now. Other times, people take those decisions slower. You know, I think there is no timeline in grief. It affects us all so differently. But we do know it changes us. And it changes us and then we change our life.
You've said before that it expands us in different directions, so it increases the amount of pain and suffering that you feel, but it also increases your capability to feel joy and love and gratitude and appreciation.
I'll tell you an example of how I was taught that lesson that really surprised me. My grief groups now, my grief educator program that I work with therapists and coaches about learning how to help people in grief. Those programs used to be in person. Now, so much of them is online. So we would be renting out meeting rooms in hotels. And we were in one big meeting room. There'd be, you know, 300 people. Then in the next meeting room, there'd be the realtors. Down the hall would be the nurses. Then there'd be the Rotary Club. And when the day was over, the staff would say, hey, what was your meeting about? And I would say, why do you want to know? And they would say, because your group was laughing the most. And I would say, grief. And they would say, what kind of grief? And what I learned is people in that room, they could cry a little harder, they could go a little deeper, but their laugh was even heartier too.
Isn't
I
it
think grief and loss expands our bandwidth for pain and for joy.
So it jolts us out of our emotional complacency, because so many of us are sort of just on autopilot. We're going along, think everything's okay, but we're operating within a very narrow bandwidth. So grief, it sounds like it shakes you up a little bit and then lets you grow.
And you see, there's so much more. And we often talk about that post traumatic stress, but I also like to mention the post traumatic growth because it occurs more often.
Post-traumatic growth. I really love that. You've said that our minds are crazy, and I agree. So many of the thoughts that go through our minds, they're not accurate. They're not a reflection of reality, and it's hogwash. A lot of it. How do you know if the decisions that you're making in the aftermath of grief are the right decisions? How do you know it's not your mind playing tricks on you again and telling you things, telling you to change careers? Maybe it's not the right move. Can you walk us through that? Are those thoughts and emotions in the aftermath more accurate than before?
I think we may not know.
Mm.
And I think that's why you need good friends, a good support network. You want to float those ideas out before you implement them and to, try to evaluate them. Sometimes the first thought in our mind, that's the first or the loudest, may not be the best one. And we want to make sure that it's a response to the situation and not a reaction because we don't want to act on something that's just coming to get us out of the pain. We want to make sure we really think these things through.
The first response is not usually the one that serves us best anyway, is it, in any situation?
Very true.
Good to control that. Now, let's talk about Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her famous 5 stages of grief. Grief is so widely known. Now, you co-authored 2 books with Dr. Ross, Dr. Kubler-Ross, excuse me, and you updated the 5 stages of grief. What are the updates that we need to know about?
Well, I think one of the things, first of all, she first wrote those stages around death and dying. They were the stages of dying. And then she very much wanted to clear up a lot of myths that were happening about you had to do them in order, they had to be linear. So she wanted to do a book on updating those stages for death to grief. And I was so honored that she asked me to work on that book with her to help her in those updating those stages. And I think one of the biggest things is that they're a loose scaffolding around how our grief can work, but they're not a map, and grief is not linear, and grief is messy. I think sometimes the media has wanted to turn those steps, those stages into 5 easy steps, but that's not really how it works. So I think we wanted to make sure that people knew that they're organic. I always say, we know how to do this. We don't really need to be taught. I often tell people, I'm teaching people what our great grandparents knew. And, it's organic. We come from a long line of dead people. There's something inside of us that knows how to do this. But we live in a modern world that, says climb every mountain, but yet sometimes we do have to walk through a valley. And for anyone who's not familiar, because most of us are, those stages are denial. I can't believe this. Anger, you're upset, you're angry at it. Bargaining, all the what ifs and if onlys. Depression, the sadness, and acceptance, the how can I learn to live with this? And the amazing thing is, those responses, those stages happen in many different ways, whether it's a job loss, a flat tire, we go through them hundreds of times without realizing it. And the thing that Kubler-Ross did that was extraordinary is she didn't invent something, she observed something in nature. It's like she literally said, I think the sun's coming up on the east and setting on the west, so that she noticed people go through, I can't believe it, or I'm angry about it. And it's so remarkable that she gave a framework to something that always felt so mysterious.
Yeah, we're not always great at knowing what's happening on the inside, are we? And sometimes it takes someone to observe and give us a framework and tell us this is what's happening. So what does that look like when you're grieving? So with these updates, you mentioned it's not linear. So that means you don't go through stage one, graduate to stage two, three, four, five. You bounce back and forth. You might go through stage one, then stage six or
I can
five.
do them all in an hour. I could do them in an hour. I could bounce all over the place in an hour. You know, I'm at peace that they're gone, but wait a minute, I'm not going to see them again. Then I get angry, and then I'm like, I can't believe, really, I'm never going to see them again. And you just go all over the place. And that's what grief looks like. And I think the other thing people don't realize is grief has a longer shadow. You know, we think about grief as the TV version. Episode one, someone dies, or the breakup happens, or the divorce. Episode two, we're challenged. Episode three, everything's fine again. Real life takes much longer. And because we're so separated from this experience, when grief isn't gone in a month, we think there's something wrong with us.
Yeah, so many of my clients, grief has a longer shadow. That's such a beautiful way of putting it. So many of my clients are frustrated with themselves that they're not getting over it faster.
And we don't, yeah. And I tell people we don't really get over it. It's not a cold or a flu. Rather, we learn to live with it.
Hmm. David, there's a sixth stage of grief that you've outlined and that you've added into the mix now. Tell us about that.
Sure. I think so many times we're a generation that we just don't want to accept this is the reality. We want to find more. And the more, I believe, is meaning. And I was so honored that the Kubler-Ross family and foundation gave me permission to add a sixth stage. And, you know, I think what's confusing when people hear a sixth stage of meaning, and that is what the sixth stage is, finding meaning, the meaning, is they go, there's no meaning in a horrible divorce. There's no meaning in a death. And I'll go, correct. The meaning isn't in the horrible event. The meaning is in us. It's in what we do after the loss. And so it really is that post-traumatic growth. How do we live with this? You know, I think many times we want to get rid of the grief and make the grief smaller, but it doesn't get smaller. We often have to grow around it.
Hmm. That's really interesting, from the perspective of clients who repress grief. Is this common to sort of say, okay, I'm not going to deal with it. I'm just going to focus on work or my family, whatever, and I'm just going to put it over here. How do you know when someone is repressing grief? What are some of the signs that they should be on the lookout for, that maybe this is something that they're doing?
Well, I'll tell you, it's what we started the conversation with. I'll wrap back around to that. But the interesting thing is, in the last book I wrote, Finding Meaning, I studied buffaloes. I never thought in my life I'd be studying buffaloes. But buffaloes, when they sense a storm coming, run into the storm, thereby minimizing the time they're in pain. Think of us, on the other hand. We often, when it comes to pain, put it behind us and want to ignore it. And instead, we have a long life with like the pain 3 feet behind us. So one of your first questions was about decision making. And how do I tell people repress it? Sometimes I'll go, that decision sounds like it's coming out of fear. And a lot of times, coming out of fear means it's coming out of grief. And so we begin to make our decisions to live our life from, I want to make sure something bad doesn't happen, instead of, This is Earth. Something bad's going to happen, but I'm going to take risks. I'm going to continue to grow. We constrict rather than expand.
So avoiding fear and repressing it, maybe alcohol, substances,
We do
fear-based.
all those things to numb the pain, to numb the
Mm,
pain, all of those things.
mm,
And, there's a part of us that's trying to protect ourselves. And I hope the more we do, like you're doing today, talking about grief, to realize there's no shame in this. It's okay to have grief. And like I tell people, any amazing sports figure or actor or any great leader, anyone you respected, read their biography. They've had incredibly horrible grief. They've gone through horrible challenges around loss, and they come through it. And so it can be the great paralyzer, or it can be an enormous sense of fuel and strength.
mm. So be like the buffalo, go into the
Be like
storm,
the buffalo, go into the storm.
embrace it. What about the role of guilt, David? Very often when someone passes away, the people left behind, they carry so much guilt. I should have done this. If only I had taken this course of action, it wouldn't have happened. Does that complicate the healing process?
It does a bit, but guilt is also very normal. But I'll tell you something interesting. The more powerful an individual is in their life, in their work, in their world, sometimes the more challenges they have with that, because they're so used to being able to control things. And then they get to death and they have no control. And here's the thing people don't realize about how our mind works. Your mind would always rather feel guilty than helpless. I'll say that again. Your mind would always rather feel guilty than helpless. Guilt is the Rubik's Cube that keeps us busy so that we don't have to go, oh my gosh, I live in a world where bad things happen. Someone else can divorce me. I can love again and something can go wrong. Other people might die. We try to find some control by being guilty, and ultimately it doesn't work. I always remind people of the 3 C's, and it's a good thing to really think about. We always want to look at any of our responsibility. Of course, we want to be responsible people, but at the end of the day, when it comes to illnesses, tragedies of life, sometimes even relationships ending, we might want to look at, we didn't cause it, we couldn't control it, and we couldn't cure whatever the issue was.
Mm,
Sometimes despite our best efforts.
mm. So it sounds as if people who have a higher preset for anxiety and they're high achievers and they're perfectionists, um, it sounds as if they might have a bit more of a predisposition to feeling guilty in the aftermath of a loss.
I should have been able to do something. And I'll tell you, I work with a lot of executives and C-suite folks and who think something happened, they should have seen it coming, whatever the thing may be. And I will say gently, but maybe a little sarcastically, if you're really going to think that's true, we're going to get you to the local hospital to save everyone, or the local mental health clinic, because the truth is you don't have that kind of power.
And that's really empowering. When you put it that way, it really lifts a load and it's really empowering.
And
So
I tell people to really go from, that what if I would have done this differently. I work with people to get them to, even if I had done it differently, they still would have died. We
mm,
cross out that what if and write even if.
even if, that's a really great tool. So what's your advice for how people can stay engaged in life, in work, after a loss? Because there is a tendency to want to hunker down, shelter yourself, and it causes problems because not everyone is financially independent, and they just can't just take a few years off work. What would your advice be there?
Well, the surprising thing about that is we do need a short amount of time to just go inward and deal with it. A short amount of time. We're going to deal with it, some of these losses, for the rest of our lives. But there's a period that the people often who will take a long leave of absence or don't choose to go back to work, many, many times, time is not your friend. Time to sit around and be in the pain isn't your friend. It's interesting. Healing looks like feeling the pain, and then we need distractions. Healing the pain and then distractions. So going back to work at a certain point is a healthy thing to do.
And you say there is a period in the beginning where you do need a little bit of time
A little
before
bit of
you.
time. And companies are getting much better at bereavement leave, but still not where it should be. And the reality is, that old model we have of 3 days, you can't even get the death and the funeral to align in those 3 days, much less all the work that has to happen afterwards. There's a company I'm really grateful to be a part of called empathy.com, that really focuses on the logistics. Because the truth is, grief makes the logistics harder, and logistics makes the grief harder. And we have, and this is going to be shocking, over 500 hours often of logistics after someone dies.
Oh,
And we assume, oh, well, they'll do it in their lunch hour. But the problem is, everywhere you need to call, do, and be and meet with, they're on their lunch hour too. So it's challenging. It's challenging.
yeah. And companies are starting to embrace this and be more aware of the needs of employees for sure. So David, here we are. You're one of the world's leading experts on grief, and you've had a huge amount of grief in your life. You lost your mom when you were 13, and around that time, I believe you witnessed a mass shooting as well.
One of the first mass shootings in the US. And so that really changed the trajectory of my life. I thought that I was going to be damaged forever. And the reality is, finding my own healing became a springboard to helping others, and really learned so much about how we can not just go through these horrible events, but grow through them.
Mhm. And you lost a son.
I did. Years ago, my younger son died, and I'll tell you, brutal. I mean, brutal. There's nothing else to say, brutal. And I got to tell you, I've been training therapists for years, and so many of them are doing the amazing work they're doing. They've turned their pain into purpose, and coaches who have turned their pain into purpose because of the losses. And they were evidence to me that healing is possible. And so, I've been very lucky that I have found happiness and joy again in my life. And I try to be evidence for others that no matter what you've been through, you can still find a life worth living that honors all the people you've had to say goodbye to or everything you've been through, that honors our strength and our resilience. And it doesn't mean that, I'm always going to miss my son. That's just going to be the reality.
Absolutely.
And I still live a life that honors him.
I was going to ask you for your final piece of advice or nugget of wisdom that you'd like to leave our viewers with today. I think you've pretty much summed everything up. Is there anything that you'd like to add for anyone who's really in the weeds with it now? What's your
Well,
advice?
I'll tell you, we have confusion around healing. What does healing look like? Because as I mentioned, we don't get over these losses. We learn to live on. What does healing look like? And I think healing looks like when those events and those losses no longer control us. Doesn't mean we forget them, but they no longer control us. And I think that's really empowering to know that you still have an important journey here. And everyone we know, I tell people the death rate's 100%. Everyone's dealing with this. We're all going to deal with it. And if we can find a way to understand it's a part of life, it can enrich life to know, we don't have forever. Let's make the most of this.
David, thank you so much for your time today. We really, really appreciate it.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you for having me.
All right. That was David Kessler, and his book, Finding Meaning, is available on Amazon.com. And we'll put a link to it in the description down below. And there's
I was going to say a new workbook coming.
a new workbook. That's exciting as well. And a lot of components and exercises to help you resolve your guilt when it comes to grief in the new workbook.
I had a waiting list that I was always feeling guilty about. So it was my way, like, what if I was sitting down with you? What would I have you do? That's the workbook.
Wonderful. Well, really looking forward to that. And you can find the link. You can order it right now by clicking on the link, which we are going to put in the description. David, thanks again. And we really appreciate all of your wisdom and your insight and your honesty today. Thank
Thank
you.
you. And anyone who's struggling, lots of free resources at grief.com to help. Thank you so much, Lisa.
All right.